you. When I was in Sunday school as a kid, one time I had a nightmare about being in heaven, just being stuck on a cloud forever. And I was like, is that really going to be my eternity?
Father, some people on campus had been exploring Greek Orthodoxy, some of those things, and I was started to get intrigued. And they said the same thing you said. If you just read the Church Fathers, you're going to become Orthodox.
But if Irenaeus read the Left Behind books, what do you think he would think of them?
Oh, golly, yeah.
Welcome to the Ascension McKinney podcast. My name is Pastor Seth Williamson. I want to thank you so much for tuning in today. My guest today is my eschatology professor from Dallas Theological Seminary, Dr. Michael Svigel, who just published his new book, The Fathers on the Future, a second century eschatology for the 21st century. And I was really interested by this because, number one, as an Anglican, I hear a lot of people talk about the Church Fathers and like to understand what did the early church believe about Christ, what they teach. But this book is making an argument that the earliest church fathers had a premillennial view of the return of Christ, which, for those of you who don't know, there's this thing in the book of Revelation that we call the millennium, which describes a 1,000-year period of the reign of Christ in which he brings about a human flourishing and perfection and redeems the world. And there's sort of a debate as to whether or not you believe in a literal millennial kingdom on earth or not. The premillennial view is that the millennial kingdom takes place for 1,000 years on earth, directly under the rule of Christ, being administered by his saints. The postmillennial view is that it occurs on earth, but it's more spiritual through sort of political means and evangelism. The entire world turns into a Christendom in which Christianity is the ruling authority in the world and becomes perfected by that work. And then Christ returns after that 1,000-year period. And the amillennial view is essentially spiritualizing all of that and saying that the millennium is essentially heaven, it's the church age, it's an allegory to describe what's happening right now, and then eventually Christ comes back and we all go to heaven with him. I was raised as a premillennialist in the Baptist church, and I went to Dallas Seminary, which is obviously a famous premillennial school, and the odd thing about me is that I've maintained my premillennial views of the end. And why is that? Why did not become amillennial or postmillennial? The reason is because I believe that the premillennial position offers a great amount of hope. It takes the beginning of the story, the Garden of Eden, where God is commanding Adam and Eve to go out and subdue the earth and to essentially take Eden, the order and perfection and pleasure of Eden, and spread it throughout the entire cosmos. That we are going to be the priest of God administering his reign throughout the entire world. And that gets interrupted by sin in the fall. It gets interrupted by that. When Christ comes, he redeems us. It is the firstborn of the new creation and resurrection. And as return, he unpauses the Eden project. And the 1,000-year reign is the completion of the Eden story. It is the resumption, redemption, and continuation of what God started and wanted to accomplish in the Garden of Eden. So it firmly says God has no plan B. What God starts, he's going to finish. God cannot be defeated by our sin. He cannot be defeated by Satan. He cannot be defeated by anything. What God begins to do, he will complete. He's not going to destroy the world. He's going to redeem it. And so it's a very hopeful view of the world, of the end, that God is going to bring all things together for his glory and for our good and redeem the world. And I also think it puts God high upon the throne of sovereignty, that God is the one who saves, God is the one who redeems, Christ is the one who enacts all that. And so even though the church fails, even though we see pastors falling and failing all over the place, even though we see these things, we know that in the end God is going to reign. And so I was very excited to get a copy of this book and read it, and I really enjoyed my conversation with Dr. Svigel, and I think you will too.
Well, welcome, Dr. Michael Svigel, to the Ascension McKinney podcast. I'm so glad to have you on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, today we're going to be discussing your new book that's set to come out, The Fathers on the Future. And I will just say, Dr. Svigel was my professor for eschatology class, and I was taking him when all the COVID shutdowns happened. So it was a rather, let's just say, appropriate time to think about the end of the world.
Yeah, it was like the end of the world for some of us.
Yeah. Not as much fun just to listen to the recordings there, but it was fun to be in class while we could.
Sure.
I was really excited for this book. Number one, so when I first saw you start posting about it on Facebook, I was just excited to get a survey of what the church fathers thought about the end times, specifically the early church fathers, the 2nd century. But as I began to read it, what I realized was, oh, this is great because you lay out the framework, the biblical framework that you use in your eschatology class. Because for those who have not taken Dr. Svigel's class or eschatology at Dallas Theological Seminary, it really is a holistic view of Scripture that says, okay, let's take God's original intentions from Genesis and then see how that plays out in the eschaton at the end of the world. And so you do a lot of that in your book to sort of bolster the case you're making for not just why we should listen to the church fathers, which I'm going to get to in a second, because that really applies to my audience when it comes to the church fathers, but also why not just that they were closer to the apostles, but that there's a real biblical argument that's going on here. So I think the first thing I do want to ask you, I think this is an interesting part of your biography and background. And I think a lot of people are surprised when they hear that a patristic scholar is a professor at Dallas Theological Seminary. And I would just say, hey, what do grads matter anyway when they say things like that? But it's a good thing. So a lot of people that are in sacramental circles, whether it's Lutheran, Roman Catholic, Orthodox, Anglican, are really into the church fathers. I have a lot of fellow priests who like to read the church fathers. And we usually get this sense, especially from the Roman church, that, oh, if you just read the church fathers, the next thing is you're going to be praying to saints and you're going to believe in the perpetual virginity of Mary and all these other things. But I'd like for you just real quick, talk about what does it take to become an actual certified patristic scholar versus a casual digester of patristic literature.
Yeah. So, yeah, I first started reading church fathers back in Bible college. This would have been probably back in 1993, probably somewhere around there. I would get home from a midnight shift at UPS and have a couple hours before classes start. And, if you go to sleep at that time, you'll never get up again. So I just thought I got to occupy my couple of hours. So I started pulling down the church fathers. Some people on campus had been exploring Greek Orthodoxy and some of those things. And I started to get intrigued. And they said the same thing you said. If you just read the church fathers, you're going to become Orthodox. So I thought, well, challenge accepted. So I started reading the first volume of the Ante-Nicene Fathers and then just started reading straight through. And one thing that one of my history professors I graduated from what's now called Cairn University, one thing he warned me about, he says, pay attention where you are on the timeline. Don't lose sight of the scope and scale. Understand where you're at. A lot happens in 200, 300, 400 years. So that was something that I saw. I was looking at the earliest church fathers, and then as you move forward chronologically, and this is what I would recommend people do, read chronologically through church fathers and keep in mind where you are and how many centuries in you are. And so that's how I started, just reading through the church fathers. And I was actually surprised at a couple things. The unity on what we would call basic creedal orthodoxy. The councils are right that this is what was handed down to us from the apostles and the church fathers, the basic Trinitarian creation, fall, redemption narrative centered on Christ's person and work in his first and second coming. And those things are very, very firmly intact. But then I was surprised at some of the diversity that you see and some of the developments. And they seem to be okay with that, even when they knew other Christians held the different things. So I started to appreciate much more the weighty matters of unity in the church, as well as the diversity within that broad Catholicity. And especially was interested in some of the things that looked with regard to eschatology, and that'll be a topic as we get into it, some of the things that they held very early on that then started to change when you got into 3rd, 4th, 5th century. and realized, oh, there is no such thing as the view of the church fathers, except when you're talking about, big picture matters of orthodoxy that we all agree on anyway. So I started dabbling in it that way. I was always interested in it through Bible college and seminary, and really got into it in my doctoral studies under Jeff Bingham, a very well-known second century scholar. Did my dissertation then in Apostolic Fathers, second century incarnational Christology, under Bingham, Kreider, and then Clayton Jefford, another very well-known Apostolic Fathers scholar, and have been publishing articles, books, attending conferences, and presenting in those circles. So, you're going to have to acquire Latin, Greek, the languages of the fathers, publishing and working in peer-reviewed circles and peer-reviewed journals. That's kind of what it takes to be a patristic scholar. And but the journey, that was a 25, 30-year journey to get where I'm kind of at today.
Yeah. So a little bit more than just picking up a copy of Augustine from the Barnes and Noble, right?
That's right. That's right. And, when people say, especially from Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox positions where, they hold to a lot of views and dogmas but an unbiased, unvested scholar is going to admit, and many of them themselves at various patristic conferences will admit, that a lot of these things that are unique to Eastern Orthodoxy, Roman Catholicism, are really third, fourth, fifth, sometimes even later developments. And they usually have a theory of doctrinal development or theology of doctrinal development that accommodates that. So when I hear of new people picking up the Church Fathers and starting to read that, I say to them the same thing that original professor said to me: don't lose track of where you are on the timeline. Sometimes I'll hear from people saying, "Yeah, our church, we do this like they did in the early church," and they're talking about something that I know is a 4th century, 5th century development.
Right.
And calling that the early church, it's early, I suppose, relative to the year 2024, but if you say, we're going to do it like the early church did it in the 4th century, that's like saying we want to restore the America of the founding fathers and then talk about the Carter administration. A lot happens in a couple hundred years. And so I'm not saying that's legitimate or illegitimate development, because there is both of those things. But don't forget where you are on the timeline and understand that things do change and develop along the way.
Right. I think people do underestimate historical theology, especially just appreciating the geopolitical backdrop of what was happening at that time. I mean, when you look at, take the English Reformation, was markedly different from the Continental Reformation because of Henry VIII and the fact they were an island. They were allowed to do things that Luther could not have done because he was running for his life. And in England, They had the entire British Navy to protect them from the Vatican. And so, those things do matter. And you're talking about, we're going from, the year 33 AD to 325 was the Nicene Creed and Edict of Milan, all that stuff. So much happens, and it does matter because humans exist in time and space. And so it's also interesting to see, like, just because a church father expresses something doesn't mean it was immediately made dogma by the Roman Church either.
Right.
Right. So some of these things were introduced at one time, but then were discussed for hundreds and hundreds of years before they even took any kind of official position. And a lot of times we're in response to some kind of controversy going on as well, which is why we don't see as many. I mean, at the very beginning, the Trinity was a huge thing that was discussed because that was the controversy of the day. But when it comes to eschatology, we look throughout the church history. I'm just kind of running through the Rolodeck of my mind. There weren't a ton of controversies that came up that really forced the issue of eschatological discussion early on. But today, it's a hot button issue again, probably because of things like the Left Behind series or other things like that we're really interested in. And obviously, Dallas Seminary is a big part of putting out a robust eschatological position. And so can you just real quick talk about why does it matter for us to discuss eschatology? Because again, when I talk to a lot of other Anglicans are not really known for systematic theology, more creedal and dogmatic. And so most of them are all mill just because they're like, yeah, at some point Jesus is going to come back, and they're right. They're right about that,
Mm-hmm.
but they don't really get into it. So if you were talking to someone who doesn't really think that eschatology is a big deal, what would you say to them saying this is why it matters as a Christian for you to study what the scriptures say about the end?
Yeah. So first of all, I would just say no. Eschatology is a big deal. It is a major theme in the New Testament, in the Old Testament, in the early church. But I do want to say the big deals of eschatology are usually the things that we all agree on anyway. So uh,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes before we jump into, well, some say this and some say that. Let's talk about what we all say, which are the foundation of the Christian hope. And the Christian hope has never been merely dying and going to heaven. In too many people's minds, and that doesn't matter if you're Protestant, Catholic, Baptist, Anglican, a lot of people in our pews are thinking that the end of our story is we die and go to heaven and get to be with Jesus, and it's actually surprising how interdenominational that very weak eschatological expectation really is. That is the Gnostic expectation: get rid of the body, get out of this world, and escape and go to
Right.
heaven. The early church and the church throughout its history has always said, no, 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 no. That may be part of it, to be absent from the bodies, to be present with the Lord, but our hope is ultimately resurrection and restoration of creation. So we will one day be resurrected just like Christ's resurrected glorious body, be conformed to that image, and be doing things. And so number one, it's just the matter of hope, and hope that God's not finished. He doesn't have a plan B. He is going to actually redeem this world. We're going to actually fulfill the purposes for which we were called. I'll tell you what, when I teach my students the end of the story, the real end of the story, which it's not anticlimactic where we just escape this world, and they realize that God is in the business of winning back, redeeming, restoring, glorifying his own creation, and we being the crowning work in that creation, conformed with Christ to Christ's bodily resurrection and being involved in that reclamation project. That's way more exciting to them. And they
Right.
very eagerly and quickly abandon this. We're going to float around in this ethereal, hazy, misty, cloudy space, basking in the light of the Lord. I remember one time as a kid saying, that doesn't sound very fun. And my Sunday school teacher said, God will change your heart so you'll have fun, by golly, he's going to make you enjoy that. It just didn't sit well with me. And I realized, well, that's because that's not the end of the story. So number one reason is it is the hope of the Christian faith. It's part of our creeds. It's part of the creed. The creed doesn't end with Christ died, rose again, and ascended to heaven. He says he will come again to judge the living and the dead. We believe in the resurrection of the body. I remember when I was raised Lutheran, we would recite the Apostles' Creed every Sunday. And I remember getting that part toward the end there in the third article where it says, we believe in the Holy Spirit, the Holy Catholic Church, communion of saints, and forgiveness, is resurrection of the body. And nobody told me that that's talking about the resurrection of our bodies.
Right.
I thought it was just, talk about Easter all over again because that's really important. I didn't know. And I didn't realize that the resurrection of our bodies and the restoration of creation, the life everlasting, and the life of the world to come, that expectation is part of the classic Christian faith expressed in all the creeds. So just being Christian, that's number one main reason why we need to understand eschatology. The other reason, though, is because if you don't understand even some of the details of eschatology, or what are within bounds, right? I admit that my amillennial, postmillennial brothers and sisters are within the bounds of basic Orthodox Christianity, but there are even variations of premillennial, amillennial, and postmillennial eschatology that are really borderline, if not out of bounds. So we all have our ugly variants that are really either dangerous or downright wrong. Being aware of where those lines are drawn will prevent people from being deceived by groups, usually sects and cults, that will answer the questions of eschatology in a wrong way. And then with that comes a lot of other bad doctrine. And I'm thinking of people who are literally knocking on your door on the Saturday mornings, feeding you all kinds of garbage. And without that knowledge of what are the foundational truths, what are the within bounds of options, that can lead to deception.
Yeah. Well, I think it's so important because I think one of the big myths that a lot of us kind of fell into, I think even some Christian scholars, is sort of agreeing with the new atheists that atheism or secularism is the default setting of humans, when it really is more of like a paganism. Like you will craft an eschatology, and I mean, tomorrow's the election. We're having a lot of eschatological discussions in the news about, climate change. If you say in 10 years the climate's going to be unlivable, that's an eschatology. If you say as an atheist that when you die, you just decay and cease to exist, that's eschatology. If you say we're waiting for the inevitable heat death of the universe, that's an eschatology.
Mm-hmm.
And I think some Christians hold those eschatologies and it impacts their life today and the decisions they make. If you think you're just going to rot, then you're going to carpe diem, eat, drink, and be merry, for I'm going to be worm food. So definitely it matters more than just sort of the fun speculation that we like to have in seminary. You mentioned it a little bit, but I did hope you would drill down a little bit more on this sort of flattened eschatology that you brought up. When you die, you either go to heaven or hell, and then in heaven there's mansions and steak and lobster, and you're going to live there forever. You're going to burn in hell forever, and you're going to float around in clouds. I'm with you. When I was in the Sunday school as a kid, one time I had a nightmare about being in heaven, just being stuck on a cloud forever, and I was like, is that really going to be my eternity? Is just floating around the sky? So, I think for us as evangelicals, we could probably point to the Second Great Awakening revivalism as to a lot of this, but maybe you have a bigger picture as to how this has not just infested evangelical circles, but also it seems, if you talk to the average Roman Catholic, they're going to say, oh yeah, you die and go to heaven. And that's what we're hoping for. So how did we get to that point? And why is it so essential for us to recover the centrality of the resurrection?
Yeah. So the way we got to that point, by the time you get into the late medieval period, how you have Thomas Aquinas discussing, the nature of eternal life and resurrection and the nature of the resurrection body and how we know you'll be able to see through it, but how transparent is it going to be? There's this kind of downplaying of the physicality to some degree that kind of kicks in already by the time you get to the third century and beyond, in especially the Alexandrian school, probably a lot of influence of Middle and then Neoplatonism and this, the realm of the ideas and the heavenly realm occupying that space, and it's being obviously superior. I don't want to overplay that because these people were creedal Christians who did believe in resurrection of the body, but sometimes that was so redefined and nuanced that the physicality of that and the redemption of this world kind of part of the narrative that was really, really strong in the second, third centuries starts to be diminished and fall out of place. That there's this almost unspoken, unquestioned assumption that the physical things themselves were of a lower quality than the spiritual heavenly things. And we forgot that God made both of those things. And he made us, as we say, psychosomatic, that is, ensouled or embodied beings, that we are made having material and immaterial parts. And that's what it means to be human, to live in a world that has invisible and visible, heavenly and earthly qualities to it, physical and spiritual. So part of it is that worldview, that separating of the physical and the spiritual, and the overemphasizing of the invisible and heavenly and spiritual, and downplaying of the physical that you see, especially in again, I don't want to throw amillennialism under the bus, but it had a strong influence. It was this more realized eschatology rather than something we're waiting for that's coming in a kind of a horizontal timeline that's coming into our world. That kind of gets turned on its end so that the kingdom is not something that's coming as much as, even though that's still off in the distance, it's more something that you're going to. So dying, going to heaven, and it's beginning to experience that glorious beatific vision already in the life after death phase of our existence. So as that kind of moves from a horizontal heading towards something to a vertical going to something, that's where you start to get this overemphasis on the spiritual, downplaying of the physical, and that carries through all the way into even into modern theology. Where you have, I hate to say it, but Jonathan Edwards and the Puritan, his perspective was, at the end of the future, he was a post-millennialist. At the end of that millennial period, Christ is going to come and he's going to catch up all of the saints into heaven. They're going to ascend into heaven, and the world below is going to be burned with an eternal fire, and the wicked are in their resurrected bodies are just going to burn in this earth that's going to burn up forever. That there's no ultimate redemption of the world. It's just such a bizarre, from an early Christian perspective, such a bizarre view of the disposability of this creation. So that's a first switch that needs to be changed in people's minds, is this world is not disposable, it's redeemable, and he's going to redeem it and restore it. So I think that's the main big difference that you see from early Christian eschatology to kind of a later over spiritualized, over heavenized, over realized eschatology that occurs beginning already in the 3rd century in some circles.
Yeah, I didn't realize it really went back that far. But this even is pervaded. Like, I grew up in a Southern Baptist church, pre-trib, pre-mill, and even in that setting, that was what we were taught was, and the rediscovery for me of the power of the resurrection has been huge in my life, not just to mention my own personal spiritual life, but having a daughter who was born at 25 weeks and has special needs. The resurrection is a huge hope for me. And I think we got to restore that, like you were saying. But it has even invaded. And one of the things you mentioned, I think a number of times in the book, was a lot of times when premillennialism, which for those who, I don't know if we said this explicitly yet or not, this is talking about the premillennial view of many of the early church fathers. They had this idea, there's a 1,000-year period we see in the book of Revelation of this divine reign of Christ, and he returns before that, and he ushers that in with his saints. But a lot of times people are opposing it. They're not necessarily really opposing that. They're opposing sort of a straw man they call premillennialism. So why do you think it has been that premillennialism has kind of fallen out of fashion in recent years? Why is it not cool to be pre-mill like it is to be post or all-mill these days?
Seth, I'm glad you say that, because it's a joke I make in class. You may remember me saying that about premillennialism. Definitely isn't the cool kid at the moment. Postmillennialism has kind of is rising in popularity in many circles. That's the view that the church is going to be victorious in the preaching of the gospel by some means, and that will usher in this Christendom where Christianity is the dominant force in all the world. And then at the end of that reign is when Christ returns. So he comes post the millennium in his return. Probably for most of the church's history, amillennialism was the popular. It was the view of Augustine. Origen of Alexandria in the 3rd century is the first explicit amillennialist, although probably his teacher Clement of Alexandria, right at the turn of the 2nd to 3rd century, was probably amillennial. He isn't as explicit. And then it dominates in some circles. They kind of compete with premillennialism for a while. And then it more or less takes over from about the 5th to 6th century, when Augustine's interpretation of Revelation 20 kind of takes off. And that is, the millennium is just a symbol for the church age. Christ has ascended. He's reigning in heaven over the spiritual kingdom. And how that plays out in the world or in the church and the lives of individuals varies. There's different forms of amillennialism. But the key is, Christ has ascended. The millennium is a symbol for that long period of time between his ascension and his second coming, at which point there will be just a general resurrection of the righteous and the wicked. So those are kind of the 3 main views with variations within them. And I think premillennialism, listen, it's, as I show in the book, it's there is no clear competitor to premillennialism in the 2nd century, 1st to 2nd century. Some have tried to float ideas of trying to push amillennialism into the 2nd century. They aren't really successful at that ultimately, but it does arise pretty early, by for sure the 3rd century, and then these kind of compete with each other. Premillennialism declines, amillennialism dominates, and then it becomes dogmatized in a lot of the Protestant confessions. So it's it's kind of, if you're part of one of those denominations or traditions, that's the eschatology you're going to get, and it really doesn't pay to try to challenge it much of the time, especially if it's part of a confessional position. Premillennialism rises again in the 18th to 19th century. It actually is cool for about 50 years, from 1900 to 1950 or so. And then it kind of overstays its welcome. Being cool, you have your day, and then you're no longer cool. Someone else is cool. So maybe I'll be cool again someday. But I like to joke that, I've never been cool, and I'm not about to start now. So I've always been kind of the nerd. So I'm with that with eschatology. So I think that's kind of the explanation. It falls out of favor for various reasons: philosophical, theological, the rise of Christendom with the conversion of Constantine, the old theology of Christ is going to come back, destroy the wicked empire, and replace it with his kingdom doesn't make as much sense when the empire is Christian. And so like you said at the very beginning, the geopolitical situation does come into play a lot of times. But the aberrations that you see in premillennialism, some of the doom and gloom, the date setting, the sign seeking, this person is clearly the Antichrist, or this kingdom here is clearly the beast that's coming up and gonna, that you can only get away with date setting and sign seeking. This is that sensationalistic approach to end times, which was pretty common among premillennialists in the 20th century for so long before people just stopped listening to you. It's the boy who cried wolf syndrome. And so in many ways, some premillennialists who have become over sensationalistic, and especially the date setters, they deserve to be ridiculed, to be honest. Let's be honest. Jesus says,
Yeah.
no one knows the day or the hour or the times and seasons. So part of that is distancing ourselves from the wildly popular, and I would say in many ways aberrant forms of premillennialism, and then just sheltering in a little bit more kind of long-standing amillennialism, or even an optimistic postmillennialism is just favored at the moment.
Yeah. And that's something we should probably talk about at the end too, is I do think that is a big part of it, is what you call this is that ism, where someone goes, this in the Bible is that, and they're basically using the New York Times to interpret the book of Revelation. And I think people rightfully go, that's very silly. The Antichrist can't be every single bad person you hate. And trying to say like the locusts or helicopters in the book of Revelation is silly. And I think people, and I still have to have discussed people where I say, no, I think John literally saw a locust with a lion's face and a sword was his tail. And they're like, no, it was a helicopter. It's like, no, I think he's just describing what he saw, but he knew it meant something else. But yeah, so I want to ask you about Left Behind near the end, but so let's dive in. Obviously, we want people to actually pick this up and look into it. I hope we pique their curiosity enough to say, well, I don't know about that, and they go and read this book. But I want to talk about some of the early witnesses to premillennialism in the 2nd century. And there's just a few that I want to highlight that I think people would recognize and find really interesting. One is that probably they won't recognize, but let's start with the first one you kind of list as the earliest witness would be the Didache. So just real quick, what is the Didache and what does it say about the end times?
Yeah, so the Didache is usually dated for sure by the end of the 1st century. It was written in stages. So I and many other patristic scholars date it sometime in the mid to late 1st century. So but between 50 and 70-ish. And it has a chapter at the very end. What it is you asked what it is. It's kind of like a manual. I call it a manual for newly appointed leaders of newly established churches. As the church is growing, they're putting in the hands of these new leaders basically, here's how to do baptism. Here's some prayers for the Lord's Supper. Here's some ways to tell true and false apostles. Some basic, morality. Here, don't live this way, live this way. What does a repentant life look like? But at the very end, chapter 16, which unfortunately we're missing the last about a paragraph of the manuscript that we have, it is basically a little eschatology. They call it a mini apocalypse, and it describes some kind of period of this lawless one. An antichrist figure. Has some language and imagery from Matthew 24 as well as 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. Even though it doesn't quote either of those, but it's reflecting that New Testament eschatology, that expectation. And then because we're missing the end, we can't tell exactly. We can't be 100% sure what its millennial view was, but it does say that when Christ comes, it says the dead will be raised, but not of all. The resurrection, but not of all. But as it is written, the Lord will come and all his saints with him. And it says, and then the Lord will come in the clouds with glory, and then it just kind of ends abruptly. So that fact that it says that the dead will be raised when Christ comes, but not all the dead, and limits it to the righteous, resurrection of the righteous. Many have seen that as an indication that more likely than not, it held to an eschatology where the righteous are raised when Christ returns, but the wicked would not be raised until after a period of the kingdom. So we can't be 100% sure, but given what we know, the varieties of eschatology at the time, probably it fits better with that Revelation chapter 20 interpretation of the righteous is the first resurrection, the wicked is a second resurrection separated by a millennium. And it is also the way many New Testament scholars have read 1 Corinthians 15 as well, where Paul gives the order of resurrections that accommodates a kind of an intermediate kingdom in some readings of Revelation 15, as I present in the book. So Didache is often seen by many scholars as sort of an early likely, we can't prove it because we're missing the ending, but early likely witness of something like a premillennial eschatology.
Yeah, and just to be clear for those who are listening, when we say we're missing the ending, it's just the ending didn't survive any of the manuscripts we have, correct?
Right. We have one manuscript of the Didache left. We have bits and pieces in other things. The manuscript that we have of the Didache actually has space in the bottom of it with a little indication that the copyist knew the ending was missing. And I like to say that the fact that he left space for it is like he was really hopeful that he'd somehow scrounge it up and find it somewhere, tucked as a bookmark somewhere and be able to supply it for us. But alas, was never able to find that ending. And so we can't be 100% sure. I'm about 80% sure the original ending described something like a premillennial eschatology similar to his contemporaries and those that followed.
It's very interesting. You'll have to help me here and make sure I put the right emphasis on the correct syllable. But the next one I'd like to talk about is, I think, one that's going to be lesser known for most people, but is Papus of Hierapolis.
Okay. Yeah, Papias or Papias or however you want to say Papias. There's about 10 different ways of saying it. He was straddling the 1st to 2nd century from Hierapolis. He was a disciple of the Apostle John, as well as an eyewitness of several other first generation eyewitnesses of Jesus. So he mentions a few people that were eyewitnesses of the Lord himself. And he wrote 5 books called 5 books of comments on the sayings of the Lord, basically. And what they are, and he mentions this in the introduction, that these are the result of interviewing the original first generation disciples of Jesus who are still alive, John and a couple others, and then their disciples, people like Polycarp, people like him who were disciples of the apostles that survived into the 2nd century, and then recording their comments on Jesus's teachings and early doctrines, etc. And the problem is we have bits and pieces of those 5 books of comments on the sayings of the Lord. We have no extant copies of that. They fell out of use. They continue to have them, deep into the patristic period, 4th, 5th, 6th century, but we don't have any copies right now. Maybe somebody will discover copies of those, but we don't have them anymore. But we have bits and pieces quoted by other people and a description of Papias of Hierapolis. And he very clearly held to Christ is coming back in the future. He's going to have a 1,000-year kingdom on this earth in which time the earth will be liberated from its bondage to corruption and be bountiful and fruitful. So he has a literal millennium following Christ's return. And later fathers kind of ridicule him for that very primitive belief.
Well, it is very interesting that, I mean, here's the guy that was a disciple of the guy that wrote Revelation, right?
Yeah.
And they're making fun of him as if he wasn't paying attention to John.
Yeah, some people. So by the 4th century, Eusebius of Caesarea attempts to drive a wedge between the Apostle John and Papias, trying to say, no, he didn't really know John. His reading of that introduction, I deal with it in the book as well as in some online excursions. It's a real bad reading of the thing. It doesn't fit the text itself, but you can tell Eusebius was not a fan of premillennialism, is trying everything he can to drive a wedge between that first generation of clear premillennialists in the 2nd century and the apostles, as a strategy to try to create some distance and say, well, Eusebius even calls Papias a man of very little intelligence and doesn't think much of him because of his eschatology.
How kind of him. So let's talk about the big guy that you really bring up probably the most in the book is Irenaeus. So tell us about Irenaeus's view of the millennium, as well as why I believe you're classifying yourself as an Irenaean premillennialist. So what does that mean to you, and why do you put such an emphasis on him?
Yeah, Irenaeus is our main player. I mean, there were others prior to him. The Epistle Barnabas is chiliastic or premillennial. Other people who are not. Justin Martyr, who has a few just little passages where he clearly believes in Christ returning, setting up a kingdom on this earth, etc. But Irenaeus becomes kind of a center point of the discussion in the book because he wrote so much on it. He wrote these 5 books against heresies, mostly against Gnosticism and Docetism, some things. But he mentions it a few times in the first few books, and then book 5, the last book, about 50%. The second half is pretty much all a very detailed. You could literally make a eschatological chart out of the way he describes, this future 7-year tribulation, followed by the resurrection of the righteous and the kingdom on earth, and followed by the second resurrection of the wicked at the end. And then the eternal state. So he goes into a lot of detail about 3.5-year reign of the Antichrist and the 2 witnesses. A lot of these things that you kind of have to wait some time in the modern era to see these detailed articulations of eschatology. He's followed by one of his perhaps disciples, Hippolytus, in the 3rd century as well, with very similar views. So he provides us with a lot of material to get an idea of what was very popular, because he was highly revered as a teacher. He grew up so he was born around 120, 130, grew up in Smyrna, which was pastored by Polycarp. Polycarp was the bishop of Smyrna at the time, who himself was a disciple of John, was ordained by John himself. So he grew up under Polycarp, left to Rome, studied under Justin Martyr. I told you was one of those witnesses for premillennialism, sometime in the 150s. And then ultimately ended up in Lyon, which is modern-day France, Gaul at the time, and is the bishop of Lyon until his death around 200. So he writes on eschatology in that second half of the 2nd century, and it seems like he's just presenting what was a pretty common view, and as we can see from other witnesses in the 2nd century, different places, it seems to have been the case. So he becomes a center point for my expressing a 2nd century eschatology as sort of the well thought out, well articulated, thorough expression of that post apostolic premillennial consensus.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible just the detail that he can go into as to exactly what's happening, and it seems like too that Irenaeus, as far as his sort of motive interpretation of Scripture, is very grammatical historical. He's not sort of doing the spiritualizing that Augustine was doing many times. When I read Irenaeus's commentaries, he's just doing what seems to be just straight up exegesis and more the plain meaning of the text. Is that sort of your impression of how he was reading Scripture?
On balance, yes. Everybody in most of church history, even the ones who have a literal hermeneutic, they will not. They don't have a problem identifying types or drawing moral principles or analogies and things like this. But they don't. Wouldn't say Irenaeus wouldn't say the allegorical interpretation is the meaning of the text. So especially
Mhm.
when he gets into eschatological issues, he says, look, it says this Jerusalem is going to be rebuilt. It says the Antichrist is going to sit in the temple in Jerusalem. And he takes these things very literally. I mean, one of his expectations is there's going to be a literal Antichrist figure who is the person Paul's talking about in 2 Thessalonians 2. It's the person that Daniel 7 is talking about. It's a person that Daniel 9 is talking about. It's a person that Revelation 13, the beast that comes out of the sea, is a symbol for the same person. And he says that person really is going to rise, going to sit in the temple of God, the temple in Jerusalem, uh, which obviously at that time would need to have been rebuilt and reign for 42 months or 3.5 years, persecuting the saints, etc., and will be destroyed by Christ when he returns. So he's taking these things extremely literally, uh, surprisingly literally by some people's standards. But he follows, though, what I describe in the book as a both and approach. So he will say, even though we're awaiting a literal fulfillment of these things, for instance, the Antichrist, ultimate future Antichrist, um, even now, so both literal and future is the main fulfillment, but even now there are many antichrists and a spirit of
Mm.
antichrist, and it's legit to see partial fulfillments in the church today. He does this pretty consistently with, we're going to see a literal future kingdom on this earth, but also the church is a spiritual kingdom, and we're living out the values and virtues and principles and priorities of that coming kingdom today. So what he teaches us is you don't actually have to choose between a literal future fulfillment and a present spiritual partial fulfillment in anticipation of that. You can hold both of these things, one as the application and the present spiritual reality of the other.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, with the typology, like we do see that the person might not be the Antichrist, but they could be in the
Right.
spirit of the Antichrist, which is what's literally talked about in the scriptures. And we have people that we're supposed to be types of Christ, where these things appear over and over again. So I think that's a well balanced approach that he's taking. Um,
Right.
so let's kind of shift here to sort of the opposition to the premillennial position that really kind of bears itself out primarily in amillennialism. Um, so you mentioned Origen is probably the earliest example that we see of someone bringing up amillennialism. And then we get into, I believe, around the year 381 is when the church sort of condemned millenarianism and said it was the heresy of the Jews or something like that. And then we even see that coming up again in the Reformation time. Anglicanism almost became one of those groups that condemned premillennialism with Cranmer's original 42 articles of religion. The last one was where he condemned millenarianism as the heresy of the Jews. I would have loved to be in a fly on the wall in those conversations as to why they cut those last ones out. But obviously, and to be clear, those listening, I'm a bit of an odd duck that I've maintained my premillennialism in my spiritual journey into Anglicanism. There are plenty of other premillennial Anglicans. Griffith Thomas, the co-founder of DTS, was obviously premillennial Anglican priest. Many of the heads of the Westminster Confession Council were premillennial, and I have actually a document on my computer of premillennial bishops in England, just to kind of cover myself. Because if a bishop thought it, then you can't get that mad at me. But kind of starting with Origen, I'm kind of blending things together a little bit for sake of time. But so Origen's coming out as this early proponent of amillennialism, and then we see this shift, not just to sort of saying, like we say today, in Anglicanism as well as many other church bodies, you can be pre-mill, all-mill, post-mill, as long as you're within orthodoxy. But there was, in certain branches of the church, there was a direct opposition to suppressing that one particular view. So just kind of start with Origen and then transition into how did it become considered to be a heresy?
Yeah. So just to keep it straight, the church has never, at least in any of the ecumenical councils, declared premillennialism to be heresy. It is, but it comes across. They begin poking fun at it. They kind of dismiss it. What's interesting is I've never encountered any church father actually refute it. Like, here's what they say, here's why that's wrong, here's what they say, here's why that's wrong. They read Revelation 20 this way, here's why that's wrong. Instead, even Augustine, when he addresses it in City of God, he says, to refute them point would just take too long. So I'm just going to give you my interpretation of the passage. I'm like, wait, stop. Give us at least a footnote. I want to hear your refutation. So nobody ever really dismantles it. They just sort of dismiss it. They make fun of it. Like you said, you even pointed out, they say, well, this is Judaism. This is the teaching of the Jews. So therefore it can't be right. So it's viewed as too earthy, too carnal. Only people who are carnal minded would hold these things. So it's also lumped together with what is a heresy, which is carnal chiasm, and that is the resurrected saints are going to rise, gorge themselves, and have sex and have children and everything, and live it up like party time for the whole 1,000 years in reward for their ascetic lifestyle in the present. I mean, that's not normal Irenaean premillennialism. That's a fringe view of, a monstrous heretic. So sometimes those things are happening. Straw men are being set up. But the Origen, and probably Clement, right before him, Clement of Alexandria, the Alexandrian school just had a tendency to be much more Platonic in a sense, dualistic, and also allegorizing and spiritualizing things. And that starts to really pick up. Many of the 3rd, 4th century fathers were chastened Origenists, as we know, the Trinitarian champions, even though some of them themselves were premillennial. They continued to emphasize more and more the spiritual over the physical, and the spiritual nature, realized nature of the kingdom. So that's kind of where that begins to displace premillennialism. But there's no official condemnation as much as there's just a castigation and a picking on and a dismissing of premillennialism when it's falling out of popularity. But so I think some of your viewers would be surprised at how many and how late there are still premillennial views, even among these church fathers. So a lot of names, Victor Irenaeus, and there's some who even make a case that Ambrose of Milan was a premillennialist of sorts, the teacher of Augustine. And it does continue on even in the couple centuries, even after Augustine. But with Augustinian coming in, he becomes a major, major influence on the theology of the church afterwards, especially in Roman Catholicism. They follow his amillennial view. But you are right. In Anglican circles, some of the strongest champions of the resurgence of, I like to call it kind of a retrieval of early Christian premillennialism, came about in Anglican circles, as well as Presbyterians, Congregationalists, obviously Baptists, even Methodists. It wasn't a point of major contention, even if it may have been a minority view in some of those circles. It was not regarded as false teaching. And even when reformers, and I'll shut up after this, when you see in things like the Augsburg Confession, the condemnation of the millenarians, the way it defines that, it says that before the resurrection of the dead, the saints will take over this world and banish all wickedness or whatever. What they're really reacting to and condemning is not what I would call a passive premillennialism, where we're waiting for Christ to come and set up his kingdom. They're actually reacting to the militant postmillennialism of the day that you see in like the peasant revolt and the Münster prophets and these various, I like to put it mildly, whack jobs that are out there trying to overthrow the Christian, the corrupt Christian kingdoms and establish this perfect society on the earth. And so you have this militant postmillennialism, which is that dangerous aberrant form that kind of pops up in the late medieval period and then has various iterations all the way even through to the modern era. So we have to understand what they're actually condemning and calling millenarian is usually a form of postmillennialism.
That's incredibly helpful. I think this is one of those things that just gets kind of thrown around of like, oh, well, they condemned it. It was a heresy, but no one ever really actually goes back and looks at the source. of all that. And I think it's good to you did a good job of parsing those
Right.
things out and spreading those issues apart. So 2 more questions real quick. Want to honor your time. So this is sort of a personal question, but also just sort of, for those who are listening who maybe are considering changing the views, which again, you've said and I've said in this conversation, it's fine to hold differing views of the millennium, because the book of Revelation is an incredibly hard book to understand. And you really have to have a broad view of the entire scriptures to even begin to interpret it.
Mm.
But for you, what is important about the premillennial view of Christ's return? Like, what are some of the aspects of it that make it that brings you the most hope and brings God the
Mhm.
most glory?
Yeah, I just had this discussion recently. I think the premillennial view, um, so I'm a writer, as you probably know, I write fiction as well. It's people say, how does a theologian become a sci-fi writer? And I say it's the other way around. I actually started in college studying literature and writing, creative writing, and science fiction, and then became a theologian. So in the storytelling process, where you have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and you have a plot and resolution, and you set up tensions and conflicts, and you resolve those, just from a storytelling perspective, the premillennial view, the Irenaean, the second century premillennial view, which I'm presenting in the book, it provides, in my mind, the most satisfying conclusion to the story. I've always, let me just be fair though, kind of a more spiritual postmillennialism does provide also, I think, a good, satisfactory ending to the story as well. I want to be totally fair to other perspectives. The amillennial view to me sits funny. There are all of these developments and all of these promises and all of these expectations developed in the Old Testament, and then I demonstrate in the book in the New Testament those ideas are taken and pushed forward and pushed forward and pushed forward, and then it's all fulfilled with a spiritual kingdom and a sudden instantaneous resurrection and judgment. It seems to not it leaves all of these storylines um, without conclusion, without wrapping them up. Whereas the premillennial view, the Irenaean classic premillennial view, has a place where promises are fulfilled, where what I call the Imago Dei mission that I developed in the early chapters is actually played out, where the purpose for which humanity was created is actually accomplished, and the perfection and identification, I call it, of creation itself, and we're ruling and exercising dominion and these kinds of things. It's just a much more fitting conclusion to the grand narrative, and it leaves you with, oh, that's great. I always feel like an abrupt, sudden judgment or a very vague view of the end of the world tends it tends to J.J. Abrams us. I don't know. Some of your listeners will know what I'm talking about with Lost, or
Yeah.
even what he did to the Star Wars sequel trilogy. It's just like, really, you couldn't actually wrap this up in a way that makes sense. So I don't want to J.J. Abrams our eschatology. I want to have a real, arc, and I think it does that for us. But it also, I think it's a more incarnational eschatology. I'm going to stand firm on that because it is not merely spiritual. It is not merely physical. It is heaven on earth, restoration of creation. Takes seriously resurrection. All that means Christ is literally reigning in this world in fulfillment of these very earthy promises. I don't think we as Christians need to be afraid of earthiness. We should be afraid of worldliness, but earthiness or physicality, those things are part of God's good creation and they will be redeemed. So I think it's super important for the grand narrative of creation, fall, and redemption.
Well, even the earthiness, I mean, we look at the sacraments, there's a foreshadowing of that.
Yes.
Of Christ's presence. Obviously, we believe in a spiritual presence, but the fact that he uses physical elements like bread and wine and water as means of grace are sort of foreshadowing that not these pieces of grain, but all the fields of grain, all the vineyards, all the waters of the world will be redeemed and be filled with God's grace. And there's a great sovereignty about it. I always use the example of, there are people who lose children and they die never knowing what happened to them. They're just gone.
Mhm.
And there's people that have bad things happen to them and they never get vindicated. And if we truly believe that God is going to be our vindicator and he's going to have vengeance and be on our side, then there has to actually be not just sort of a spiritual, well, I forgive you and I say it's okay, so it's okay, but God will actually reunite people and actually vindicate people and bring them back together. To me, I agree with you. I feel it's way more satisfying, and I think is what is in line with the biblical narrative. So here's our last question,
Mhm.
and this is sort of a fun one. But if Irenaeus read the Left Behind books, what do you think he would think of them?
Oh, golly. Yes. He would probably, I'd be able to, so Irenaeus, his name means peace, and he really is a peacemaker. If you are an Orthodox Christian who believes in the real virgin birth and incarnation of Christ and the Trinity, and that you could be saved by grace and all of these things, right? If you're an Orthodox Christian who holds the regula fide, the basic creed of Christianity, he's extremely gracious toward you. So I think he would be gracious toward them, and he would say, "Yeah, I can see the basic contours of my eschatological chart," because he does, to the surprise of many, he has a future 7-year tribulation that he actually ties to the 70th week of Daniel, that he views as
Mm.
yet future. That's the earliest understanding of the church when they talk about it. That 70th week of Daniel is yet future, a literal antichrist, a literal. He even has something like the assumption of the church. I describe that in there and make a case for it there. And then on a much more extensive online excursus, I deal with the rapture question as well. So he would be able to identify the basic contours of his eschatology, but I think he would be, like I am, pretty unimpressed by the liberties that are taken in a lot of the speculations. And I think I have to admit, I'm going to make a confession. I'm probably the worst, premillennial futurist evangelical out there. I've never read any of the Left Behind books. So or watched any of the movies. I remember one time in a class, a student raised her hand and said, "Hey, in Revelation where it says this, and that, what do you think about that?" I'm like, "What is she talking about? I don't." And somebody said that she did something in the Left Behind books. So sometimes we'll read these fictional things and confuse them because we don't have a firm grasp on scripture. So I'm okay with creative writing and fiction and those kinds of things, but oftentimes we grab onto the fanciful and neglect the reality. And I think Irenaeus would have thought they were similar to the weird speculative musings of the Gnostics, where it's confusing people. It's not actually helping people. So that's my personal opinion. I don't want to trash those. I know people have been very entertained, and I've even heard of people who were, say it caused them to rethink their views on things and become closer to Christ through them. So I'm not going to say God can't use those things, but I'm not personally a fan of the sensationalistic and speculative nature of them.
Yes. Yes, and I do think it's important to remember that primarily it's these books like that are entertainment. It's entertainment for
Right.
Christians, and that's sort of my confession is I've never watched the Chosen series, and everyone loves the Chosen, but for a similar reason is I view it as my role as the preacher to live in the world of the text and to not
Right.
allow an artistic sort of blending of the Gospels to sort of pollute is not probably a strong word, but influence my understanding of who Jesus was. And I do worry that just like Left Behind, people are going to read that and go, well, you know how all the kids get raptured? It's like, whoa, there's a big discussion of what happens to kids when they die, right? So how do you know it's
Right.
all the kids that get raptured? Or if there is a rapture, it's like, how do you know? It's not Tim LaHaye didn't write Revelation. But the same thing goes for that.
Right.
It's like they're trying to portray Peter or Matthew as autistic or things like that. It's
Right. Yeah.
things we've all heard growing up about who he could have been, but is not really looking at the story as it was written. So,
Yeah, it's really hard then for people to read the actual text then without that sort of interpretive lens that has been fed to them by the creative expression of it. So that's my concern. I think Irenaeus would have similar concerns about confusing the text from the the interpretations or comments on the text.
Well, very good. Well, thank you so much for your time, Dr. Svigel. Where can people find you, and where can they get the book from?
Yeah, so the book can be found anywhere you can buy books. Amazon has them. Pretty much every online bookseller will have them. It's but I would, if you don't mind me plugging the website, there's a companion website where you can also click and order the book. It'll just send you to Amazon, but it's fathersonthefuture.com. That's where I house all of the free resources, online excurses that go into a lot more depth in some of these things. And the book itself refers to these online excurses, and that's where you'll find that there's no, paywall. It's all free. There's a massive amount of free resources, but a lot of those excursions won't make sense unless you've read the book itself. So you can get the book pretty much anywhere. Fathersonthefuture.com is the website.
Fantastic. And I will also plug your other book, Retro Christianity, for all my Anglo-curious Baptist brethren watching this channel. That's a good book for people that are interested in just breadcrumbs towards other ways of doing church that may get you to come join us in the ACNA. But either way, fantastic stuff. Dr. Svigel, thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you soon.
All right. Thanks a lot.